I always wonder, like, individuals who want to, like, they think, oh, let's start a company. My question back to them is, who asked you? Who in this community that you're a part of asked for you to create another company?
Hello, and welcome to Art Restart, where we learn from artists who, wherever they work, whatever they make, are shaking up the status quo in their fields and in their communities. I'm Piercarlo Talenti, the producer and editor of this podcast, which is brought to you by the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. In this episode, we'll be speaking with Annalisa Diaz and Tara Moses, the co-directors of Groundwater Arts. Annalisa and Tara are both playwrights and directors, and Annalisa recently started her newest position as co-director of Here Art Center, the noted off-Broadway performance incubator. In 2018, Tara and Annalisa, along with artists Anna Lathrop and Ronee Penoi, undertook a project to braid together goals and passions that at first glance might seem disparate: striving for a climate-just future and decolonizing the arts and culture field. Since then, Groundwater Arts has created countless opportunities, whether through creative projects, consulting, or virtual and in-person gatherings, for cultural institutions to learn how they can start dismantling those structural inequities that for generations have not only harmed communities of color, but also exacerbated the climate crisis. Early on, the four co-founders also created a document titled Green New Theater that lists precise principles to guide American theaters in responding to the climate crisis. Annalisa spoke to me from her home in Baltimore, and Tara from Rhode Island. Before I asked them about their founding Groundwater Arts, I wanted to make sure I had a solid understanding of the organization's core belief, namely that environmental justice is inseparable from decolonized and racial justice. I've been reading a lot, for instance, about how indigenous practices of forest management could prevent the sort of super fires the American West has been experiencing. But I wanted to know how else decolonized and environmental justice are inseparable.
Tara, do you want to go or you want me to go?
Yeah, I can take the decolonized piece if you want to then hit it with the racial.
Sure.
What a way to phrase
That's good teamwork. That's awesome.
Yeah, also what a way to phrase that. So this is Tara Moses speaking here. The climate crisis did not exist before these like global acts of colonization. Like there is no, was it the chicken or the egg? No, it was quite clear where this came because we did not see these like massive disasters until after like the global effect of colonization, settler colonialism, and even and also neocolonialism in these communities in which all of resource like land, water, etc., were made into resources and translated into wealth. How we see that in action, I mean, obviously, like you have the example of like the wildfires on the West Coast, but even in like the extreme flooding in like the South of the United States, and a lot of native plants that have been there since time immemorial, who have since been like removed for these like settlements for people to live, has then resulted in like higher flood issues. Furthermore, like the land itself not being governed and taken care of by the individuals who have the ecological knowledge, aka the indigenous peoples of this continent, has just resulted in like people who don't know how this land works and then just deciding to build things on it. You know what I mean?
Right. So they only know how to extract, not caretake necessarily.
Yeah, exactly. There we go. That's the phrase. Extracting, not caretaking. And this is thousands and thousands of years old knowledge at this point. And it's like, oh yeah, people are just now speaking about how like indigenous ecological knowledge is what we need to help combat the climate crisis. And it's like, yeah, y'all, we done been new about all of this. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I can keep going on and on, but I mean,
Thank you. No, it was a tall order to ask you to just, hey, give me the ultra Cliff Notes version. No, that makes sense to me. So Annalisa, you were going to tackle it from a different angle.
I think part of, just to underscore what Tara was sharing, is that the climate crisis that we're currently experiencing, the roots of it are colonial capitalism. That's another way to say what Tara was sort of getting at. And then the other side of that is that the impacts of the climate crisis disproportionately affect Black and Brown and Indigenous communities first and worst. So, for example, with the flooding that's happening right now because of Hurricane Helene, or like the many hurricanes along the Gulf Coast, right? The communities that are most marginalized, that are most like intentionally impoverished, are Black and Indigenous communities along the Gulf Coast. And so those communities suffer the most.
Because the only places they were allowed to live were in floodplains.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And like the environmental justice movement has been pointing this out for decades. And it's the idea is too that like thanks to things like governmental policies of redlining in various cities. I'm calling from Piscataway land in Baltimore that literally invented redlining,
Oh.
and piloted it for the rest of the country. And what it does is create actual governmental housing policies that restrict where communities can live based on racial lines. And that decades old, those decades old policies are still having impacts today. So, like, for example, in Baltimore, one of the ways that Baltimore gets rid of its waste is with a giant incinerator. And that giant incinerator was built basically right in the middle of Black communities. And so those communities in Baltimore have higher instances of asthma and cancer. And there's actually some studies done that show that based on, there's actually, I'd love to recommend this book called The Black Butterfly by Dr. Lawrence Brown. He's a public health researcher at Morgan State University, and he's done some incredible work to show the present day impacts of historical policies around redlining and the ways in which Black communities, like the actual at the neighborhood level, have disproportionately negative health impacts with relation to white communities in Baltimore. And it's like he traces it directly back to government policies.
What made you and your two other co-founders decide to take this knowledge and use it towards cultural and arts institutions? Was there an instigating moment? How did you decide to come together and create Groundwater Arts?
This is Annalisa. I can take a swing, and then Tara, feel free to jump in if I forget anything. I would say that back in 2017, 2018, we all four of us were working in various different capacities in the theater and performing arts field. And we sort of noticed that there was some movement building and organizing around decolonization and racial justice. And then, sort of separately, there were groups of people that were doing like eco theater or theater about climate change. And we observed that those two groups were not overlapping. And we were like, y'all, this is the same problem. As we just said, the roots of the climate crisis are colonial capitalism. So how can we talk about decolonization without advocating for a climate just future? How can we talk about climate change and like responses to ecological crisis without acknowledging the environmental justice, like the justice component of that work? So really it was that we were just moving through the world, I think, as artists ourselves, and noticing a gap. And we thought maybe we could help fill that gap. Tara, would you add anything?
No, that sounds right to me. I think like for me specifically at the time of Groundwater's founding, I was based in Oklahoma and so had a very, very different experience when it comes to people like connecting the dots to things. And so this also just seemed like a really great opportunity of like, oh, how can we, with the four of us who are operating in different places throughout the country at the time, reach a broader group of individuals to increase the retention of all of this and like increase like the sort of like people like sort of really kickstart this conversation in many different areas, especially for my own self being part of the part of the South.
Now, I read the Green New Theater that the four of you, this living document that the four of you created. It lists 6 principles: community accountability, publicly transparent budgeting, decolonized leadership practices, sustainable resources, right relationship to land and history, and immediate divestment from fossil fuel interests and sponsorships. So I'm curious, though, in terms of your co leadership style, did you, as you started to put the organization together and figure out how you're going to lead together, did you hew to those principles yourself from the start, or did you have to develop them?
Oh, yeah. I think this is Tara again. What is so unique about groundwater and how we formed, and like I sing it from the rooftops all the time, is that we spent like 6 very intentional months figuring out what is it that groundwater could be, what are the values that we have as an organization, because we had the wonderful opportunity to be like, okay, cool, these are our values in regards to art and advocacy and social change and what we're trying to make happen. And so it was like, okay, well, then now what is the best container to make that happen? Because there are many, many problems with like the nonprofit industrial complex. And also from the get go, we were like, we don't want to do this. We don't want to be a nonprofit. And so since we took that time, we were able to like create what are the best financial models for us that made sense. How is it that we are, not contributing to colonial capitalism and how we make money? What are the ways in which we can like pay it forward, quite literally pay with dollars to these frontline communities who are the most vulnerable to the climate crisis? Anyway, and so in that 6 months it was sort of like, yeah, 100%, these like 6 principles that you see in the Green New Theater is also evident in how we exist and move through as a company.
That's just kind of revolutionary, because when people get together to form an organization, the go-tos, you become a 501c3, but you decided not to. So what is the model you developed?
We formed as an LLC partnership, and then we have a fiscal sponsorship relationship with Producer Hub, which shout out to them, they're amazing. So we are still able to accept grants for some of the work that we do that is sort of technically like in the nonprofit world, right? Like it's for for social good, and we accept that through a fiscal sponsor. But we are not, Groundwater Arts is not a 501c3, so we are not beholden to a board, and we are not beholden to the same sort of nonprofit governance structures.
So yeah, so tell me why that was so crucial to you from the start.
I mean, I would say, Tara, I'd be curious to hear what you would have to say about it too. But I mean, on one hand, there's like simply the efficiency of being able to make decisions for our own selves about what kinds of projects we wanted to take and what we wanted to do with the money and whatnot. But then there's a sort of bigger philosophical gesture, I guess, where we're not interested in just forming yet another 501c3 that then has to like jump through all of the hoops. Because basically, and also just to recommend another book, Insight, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. The nonprofit industrial complex is like, this is a well theorized phenomenon. So we didn't just make that up. Yeah, the whole nonprofit sector is and was founded basically to protect the wealth of the white like wealthy upper class, and actually to police movements. So that's a big thing. Just to say, and yeah, we were like not interested in perpetuating that if we could avoid that in our small way by just not forming another 501c3. Tara, would you add anything?
Yeah, I think what I'll also add is, with the nature of 501c3,
Hmm.
the financial and judicial responsibility falls into the board of directors. And while the four of us are deeply in alignment with each other, the moment that it's like we're thinking about a board, we are handing over some of this, like that decision making power and that responsibility to other folks. And while we, even as an LLC, because again, we believe in community accountability, we have a like
Hmm.
community advisory board of individuals who keep us in check. It's a very different structure, like having folks deeply embedded in our communities, folks who are elders in these communities, check in with us to provide that community accountability support rather than individuals whose jobs it is to be like, let's look at the budget, let's look at the governance. You know what I mean? Like, we're able to actually continue to center the values and the work that we're doing in that way. Finally, too, I'll add is that because there's so many restrictions in like federal law on like what 501(c)(3)s can and cannot do, especially when it comes to like political organizing, like there isn't anything about trying to combat the climate crisis and whatnot that is gonna make the government happy, right? And it's like, I think also to think about like long term of, this is just something we don't want to mess with. Whenever we have this freedom of an LLC, like we're not worried about like, oh my God, can we make these political statements?
And so what have you, in the years you've been working with Groundwater Arts, what discoveries have you yourselves made that you did not know before?
I would say that collaboration within the art sector doesn't have to suck. um,
So it sounds like you're speaking from experience. So what?
yeah, yeah. I
So
mean,
so how did collaboration used to suck, and how
well,
does it?
I just worked in so many different contexts where values weren't actually aligned, or like people would say things like their values were aligned, but then in practice they really weren't, or other contexts where because of I don't know, whether it was a nonprofit that was beholden to a specific fiscal year cycle or whatever, like, or like just those cycles of planning where it's like everything feels urgent all the time, and it feels sometimes like there's no way out of it, and then people are under pressure and they mistreat each other. Like, we've all worked in those kinds of situations, and I distinctly remember multiple times through the sort of height of the beginning of the pandemic where we would be in groundwater arts meetings and be like, oh, why is this working so well? Like, what are we doing differently that than in, because we all four of us were working in like at the same time as we were working with Groundwater Arts, we were all doing other full time or like almost full time independent artistry or full time jobs in other theater institutions or arts institutions. Anna sort of moved from theater into the design world, and yeah, she was having different experiences in sort of like design consulting. And every time we would meet up as a groundwater arts team, we would be like, oh, wow, we all trust each other and we all know how to communicate and our values are actually aligned. And isn't that funny how much more efficient you can be if your values are actually aligned? Yeah.
Do you think? Well, we've talked about the pandemic, which theaters were struggling before the pandemic, and certainly are doing more afterwards. And the pandemic seemed like an opportunity to either start back at where they were beforehand or really press the reset button. Are you hopeful about the state of theater going forward?
Tara.
Hmm. I was over here thinking, I was like, is hopeful the word I would use? Um, I would say I am more excited about the transition and what could be because through the pandemic, yeah, we saw some like great devastation of many theaters and programs like closing their doors and whatnot. And, I mean, everybody and their mama tell you that I'm gonna be one of the first people who will be like, hell yeah, burn it to the ground. Everything's need to burn. um, Annalisa laughs. um, and so I think like I am really excited to see some of these systems fall that need to fall. Something that,
Mm-hmm.
we've said as groundwater all the time is that you can't build a sturdy house on a rotten foundation. And so much of the foundation of the greater American theater is deeply rooted in settler colonialism. It's rooted in racism. It's rooted in colonial capitalism. And so, like, you can't, oh my gosh, here I am. I'm a little Bob the Builder myself. So, you can have the highest quality of drywall. You can hire the best contractors to build your house. But if your foundation is still rotten, that house is going to fall down. And I think like that's what we're seeing in real time is so many of these theaters foundations can't support it anymore. And so these buildings, they're falling down literally and metaphorically. And so I'm very excited to see how do we rebuild? Like, where are the theaters who have been like built on these strong foundations? Like, how are they being able to set up to succeed? I'm excited about all of the individuals who have now become like building inspectors and can see cracks in the foundation for the first time. I think so. We're in a massive time of change, and I'm really excited to see what that is. And also with that, embracing that, like, it's probably not going to look the same. And if that's the case, maybe it shouldn't have in the first place. Annalisa,
You really carried that metaphor the whole way through, didn't you?
I love Bob the Builder.
If a metaphor works, you got to flog it. So if let's say a young theater artist were listening to this and she had a very strong vision of what kind of theater she wants to make and wants to create a company, but do it in a way that is likely to succeed in this 21st century, that follows the green theater's principles, what is the first thing you would counsel her to do?
I think I would want to have a conversation about, do we really need another company, or what's the goal? Is it are we yeah, I don't know. I'm like, well, I it just never occurs to me to want to start a company first. I'm like, what are we actually working on? What are we trying to do? And is a company the best vehicle for that work? Yeah, I think that's where I would start.
That's so interesting, because even it shows my block too, that a company is what you make when you want to create a lot of projects. But what are alternative ways of thinking?
Oh, I mean, like, if there are projects that someone wants to make, like, do you need a company for that, or can you create partnerships, or do I don't know, like, get help on get an independent producer on board? Can you marshal resources in a different way than just like creating another company in the world that then has to do all of the things that a company does? If the answer is yes, like, if the answer is actually yes, we do need another company, and here are the reasons why. I mean, we decided to create Groundwater Arts as a company. We formed it as an LLC, as we talked about, but I don't know that was like a foregone conclusion.
And I also think we also say this a lot too, especially if we were talking about like the regional theater system and how that's like settler colonialism in action. I always wonder, like, individuals who want to, like, they think, oh, let's start a company. My question back to them is, who asked you? Who in this community that you're a part of asked for you to create another company? And it's like, if the answer is, well, nobody asked me, I just want to do it,
Right.
then I'm like,
is it
okay, well,
about your ego? Is it about your ego or serving the community? Right.
right. I was like, because we have plenty of these theaters that started as a vanity project, and we're seeing them now fall down because our foundation's rotten. So it's also an opportunity to be like, are there individuals in your community whom you can align with to create art and support them while you're also like moving through what is it that you feel called to do? Because, I mean, I say all the time, I was like, did the Black and Native people ask you to come into their neighborhood and create a theater and then, get all this critical success and then price them out of their own neighborhoods? Did they ask you to do that? No? Then why are we going to do it again?
You can learn more about Annalisa and Tara and read a written version of this interview at uncsa.edu/artrestart. Do you know someone who you think would really like this episode? Please let them know about it. Art Restart is on all the podcast platforms, and we truly appreciate your word of mouth to help us reach new listeners. Our theme music is by Shanghai Restoration Project. I'm Pierre Carlos Lenti, and on behalf of the Keenan Institute for the Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts, thank you for listening.